Narendra Modi as one of 37 predators of press freedom.
A Hindu temple in the northern city of Ayodhya. For Muslims, it evokes painful memories.
World leaders who are accused of censorship and targeting those who work in the media.
Absolutely misguided information to you. From where you have picked up this type of garbage, I do not know.
They specifically curate stories that are negative.
The biggest weapon in the arsenal of the BBC against India has always been its documentaries.
The cop in Dubai.
Let me stop you right here.
I suppose we could say the biggest scam of the last century and this century, the BBC.
Well, hang on a second. You said you've seen more hateful content, but you can't name a single example, not even one.
I think it really is time to put the BBC, this agent of chaos and discord, this modern Chakravyus. The constitution is a Chakravyus, the legal system is a Chakravyus, the penal code is a Chakravyus, the education system is a Chakravyus. And like Abhimanyu, we have wandered in these Chakravyus thinking one day we will be free, but we don't know how to break the Chakravyus. The only way you can win in a Chakravyus is to defeat and break the Chakravyus itself. So when you have Chakravyus which are made of language, you need to have the language to destroy them. And this is what the documentary is intended to do for you. We're going to share with you little excerpts of each of the various chapters. There are 5 chapters, just enough to give you an idea. And then at the end, hopefully, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. Please play chapter 1. Propaganda on behalf of the king's enemies. He was judged to be such a powerful weapon of mass destruction that he was given the punishment reserved for the perpetrators of the most heinous war crimes, concentration camp guards, mass murderers, etc., execution. I'm afraid that I can't help but wonder What if the BBC were to have similarly weaponized broadcasting to the level of it becoming a WMD, capable of directing the same devastation as William Joyce, but now in every language, to every home, in every country, in every corner of the world? The BBC is capable of manipulating the minds of billions. Like Joyce, it could be capable of making millions of people feel fear, feel hatred, inflict violence, and then potentially disappear without a trace. Could its controllers resist the temptation to use such a weapon? Has the BBC been used in this manner to demoralize, to incite violence, and to destabilize whole societies? If it were to be used in this manner, I shudder to imagine the scale of the harm to global peace that it could inflict.
13 judges, 133 high-ranking civil servants, including diplomats, and 156 senior retired army officers, dubbed the recent BBC documentary called India, the Modi Question, as delusions of British imperial resurrection. The letter says they would serve journalism better by running a series on the Bengal famine called UK, the Churchill Question.
The first charge that I would bring to a court of law against the BBC is that it was never intended to be a news service, that it was always designed from the ground upward to be an agent of propaganda, an agent of discord, an agent of incitement. Now that's quite a large charge to allege against any party. But that would be the first charge. I would like to present to you some evidence to support that charge. Vinodji, next please.
Just like the establishment of other potent colonial tools, like the British East India Company in 1600, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, too was established under a royal charter issued by the British monarchy on the 1st of January 1927. Its purpose: to control and discipline what was then a poorly understood medium of mass communication. Fondly called the Beeb or Auntie, the BBC has been singularly responsible for shaping and moulding the mindset of the British public, as well as the unwashed masses dominated by Britain across the globe, right from Asia to the Middle East to Africa. The part of the empire that was supremely crucial to Britain, and hence the BBC's plans, has always been the crown jewel of the Raj, India. And why not? After all, from the 1st century to the 17th century, the period before the British arrived on its shores, India's GDP ranged between an incredible 25 to 35% of the world's total GDP, more than all of Europe combined. That is, till the British colonizers came along. An academic research study by renowned economist Utsa Patnaik, published in 2019 by Columbia Press, based on nearly 2 centuries of detailed data on taxes and trade, showed that Britain drained a total of nearly $45 trillion from India during the 173-year period from 1765 to 1938. For all we know, it was India's money that paid for the significant investments in technology and infrastructure that eventually became the BBC. As one delves deeper into historical annals, it becomes clear that beyond just concealing the looting, there was a far more important reason behind Britain's and the BBC's desperate interest in shaping the opinion of India's masses. The British Raj's war campaigns across the globe needed an endless supply of foot soldiers. Nowhere else in the world was there a readily available supply of tough battle-hardened and disciplined men other than in the martial races of India. India's soldiers, with 800 years of experience of battling and defeating the Mughals and other Islamic invaders, themselves became the empire's own colonial army. Countless cases abound in British military history where an unthinkable victory under the toughest conditions was delivered purely on the back of the bravery displayed by Indian soldiers, fighting under the flag of their own colonial oppressors. Francis Yeats Brown, in his book Martial India, captures the enormous Indian contribution in World War II, writing, "India has 2 million volunteers fighting in the Allied cause. It is the largest, and I think the least publicized army of volunteers ever gathered under any flag." The significance of this state of affairs was not lost on Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master Nazi propagandist. Goebbels tailored bombastic Nazi radio broadcasts to target the 2 million Indian soldiers in Europe, as well as the next batch of potential recruits in India. The prevailing anti-British sentiment was exploited to the hilt in these broadcasts. Early German victories were inflated and emphasized with an intention to damage the morale of the indispensable Indian volunteers. The carpet bombing approach of this German radio propaganda was crushing Britain's own propaganda efforts to hold on to their crown jewel of India. It forced a panicked BBC to immediately launch a dedicated broadcast of its own propaganda in both English and Hindustani. Curiously, the specialist they chose to run the Indian propaganda section was none other than a certain George Orwell, later of 1984 fame. This appointment was ironic, given that Orwell's book, Burmese Days, which was critical of the Raj, had been banned in India by the British government. Despite this, the BBC gave Orwell the task of writing broadcasts targeting Indian audiences. It seems that the policy of message manipulation by a writer of fiction trumped over actual news. Messages and narratives were tailored specifically for different audience groups, and the skill of the wordsmith mattered more than facts or Orwell's personal perspectives. At this time, the British desperately needed to overhaul their image from a global pirate to a generous benefactor of India. You see, by this time, British colonialism had killed over 100 million Indians in nearly 40 years. Along with other staffers, the BBC enrolled Orwell onto a special training course meant to teach the finer nuances of the art of radio propaganda. The poet and literary critic William Empson, who was Orwell's coursemate and colleague, described the training course as the liar's school of the BBC. Orwell himself said, "One rapidly becomes propaganda-minded and develops a cunning one did not previously have." As the director of European broadcasts, Newsom led what is still the biggest propaganda operation ever mounted in 25 different languages, broadcasting 24 hours a day across 3 wavelengths. It was Newsom who first implemented the strategy to use news as a weapon of war. It was Newsom who weaponized the news to reinforce the idea of British imperial superiority, whilst at the same time creating the myth of a hallowed BBC. So successful was this strategy that it prompted Joseph Goebbels to warn the Nazis in 1944, "There is one way in which the British, despite the narrowness of their political thinking, are ahead of us. They know that news can be a weapon and are experts in its strategy." Years later, the carefully manicured projection of an avuncular Auntie Beeb based on culture, music, and humor would be skillfully layered over this imperial strategy. Let us turn to John Reith, the first Director General of the BBC, and the person largely responsible for forging the institution as we know it today. His comprehensive and unambiguous diary and memoirs reveal much about the foundational principles of independence and impartiality at the BBC. A cabinet meeting, according to Reith's diary, took the view that the government should be able to say that they did not commandeer the BBC, but they know that they can trust us not to be really impartial. In other words, it was seen that there were advantages in retaining at least an appearance of an independent BBC. Just an appearance. A pretense, really. On 9th March 1933, Reith recorded in his diary, "I am pretty certain that the Nazis will clean things up and put Germany on the way to being a real power in Europe again. They are being ruthless and most determined." Now, this extraordinary, almost admiring excerpt from the personal diary of the founding director of the BBC suggests that he harbored pro-fascist, pro-Nazi views. A year later, in July 1934, following the Night of the Long Knives, in which the Nazis ruthlessly exterminated their internal dissidents, Reith wrote, "I really admire the way Hitler has cleaned up what looked like an incipient revolt. I really admire the drastic actions taken, which were obviously badly needed." And then 5 years later, after Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Nazis in 1939, he wrote, "Hitler continues his magnificent efficiency." In 2008, the BBC was criticized for referring to the men who carried out the 26/11 Mumbai terrorist attacks, which killed nearly 200 innocent civilians, as gunmen rather than terrorists, the term that is typically used to describe similar attacks in the UK. In protest against the use of the word gunman by the BBC, the famous Indian journalist M.J. Akbar refused to take part in the BBC interview after the Mumbai attacks. It turns out that the BBC's imperialist attitude towards India has not escaped the attention of other Western journalists either. Writing for the 2008 edition of the Historical Journal of Film, Radio and Television, Alastair Pinkerton analysed the coverage of India by the BBC from 1947 to 2008. His conclusions are uncompromising. Pinkerton observed a tumultuous history involving allegations of anti-India bias in the BBC's reportage, particularly during the Cold War. He concluded that the BBC's coverage of South Asian geopolitics and economics showed a pervasive and hostile anti-India bias because of its alleged imperialist and neo-colonialist stance.
It seems some sort of psychosis. It seems to have some sort of madness when it comes to Indian Hindus. It's almost as if those in governance at the BBC have set a tone which says, whatever you do to all the producers of news, make sure that you undermine India. That message comes across loud and clear.
The biggest weapon in the arsenal of the BBC against India has always been its documentaries. These have repeatedly provoked the ire of Indians and elicited bans from the Indian government for being biased, incendiary, and far-fetched enough to the point of being completely fake. Take the case of their recent documentary made on the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which was almost 2 decades in the making. The documentary was a full-on attack on Prime Minister Modi for an alleged role in the 2002 Gujarat riots, in which the BBC appeared to blame him squarely for the harm inflicted. Now, why would the BBC dig up a painful case after 2 decades, given that Prime Minister Modi, who was the Chief Minister of Gujarat at the time, was thoroughly investigated by the highest court in India and found completely innocent? From the looks of it, there are ample grounds to conclude that the BBC knowingly executed a media hit job on India and Prime Minister Modi, wasting precious public funds on a propaganda project intentionally targeting a friendly, democratically elected sovereign government. And to what end? Perhaps seeking to instigate regime change or incite insurrection amongst its people. The BBC is no stranger to regular criticism for its peculiarly biased documentaries on India.
You will now have had a glimpse of the nature of the documentary that we are launching. I received the blessing of having Navitaji's wonderful voice made available to me, And I hope you can see that the carrying of such a message is so dependent upon the tone. So this is an extraordinary achievement. I never expected it to be done. Secondly, I'm a scholar. I like my books. I like to write things that annoy people. I have no idea about animation, graphics, videos, and all this fancy stuff. But somewhere along the line, my hopes were heard, and Vinodji and his string team stepped up and said, we will partner with you and provide the technology to be able to achieve this work. Navitaji, before I hand over to you, it's wonderful that you're all here. Sangatan mein Shakti hai, and in our tradition, we know about the value of Upanishads, sitting close together to share ideas. But at this moment in time, I've just been informed that we have over 10,500 viewers looking at the documentary and the launch that we're doing here right now at this moment in time. Sanjayji, thank you. You're all here. Those of us who are Twitter warriors, I would ask you, if there is something that you hear which is a surprise to you or a shock to you, please feel free to tweet whatever you wish to, and let's keep the momentum going and build it out there. Hashtag BBC Mukt Bharat. Okay? Navitaji, over to you.
Jai Shri Ram. So we're all familiar with the staggering decline of GDP of India during the colonial period, the $45 trillion worth of value that was taken from the people and the country. But what's not so well appreciated is the enormous contribution to the British war efforts that Bharat made at the time. The initial part of the video showed how important it was for the British establishment to brainwash and recruit as many Indian soldiers as possible to fight for Britain in its wars. So it's no surprise that they perfected the art of propaganda, so much so that even the Nazis appreciated how skillful they were in using news as a weapon of war. One of the covert wars that they played was the war of words, to recruit Indian soldiers. And it's fair to say that without the Indian soldiers' contribution, Britain would have lost World War II, and the Nazis would be ruling Europe today. So Bharat saved Europe.
Please let me emphasize this. Historians in the West acknowledge that World War II was won because of the resources that Bharat provided. And yet how few of us know this. They recognize that without the 2 million soldiers on the ground, without the 500,000 donkeys that were provided, without the 500 million rounds of ammunition that went from the factories here, World War II would have been lost if it hadn't been for the Bharatiya contribution. And yet nobody talks about this. We're going to talk about this. Thank you, Navita.
If one looks at the history of the BBC, especially in the last 35 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the broadcaster has been very fanatical in its support for what's called the Euro-Atlantic agenda, meaning the expansion of NATO for an increased military interventionary role or a role of Western superpowers in the affairs of other countries. So, for example, in the 90s, you had the Yugoslav Civil War and the Kosovo War as the country was breaking up. The British media, led by the BBC, was a big cheerleader for sanctions and military intervention in favor of separatist minority groups in order to break up a non-aligned socialist federal republic into many smaller states, which could be easily cultivated after the Civil War and turned into Western vassals. And if this had happened in a Western country, the BBC would have been quite critical of it. For example, Spain is a NATO member and a European Union member who has had similar struggles with what they call terrorists and separatists in the Basque Country and Catalonia, which want to break off provinces from Spain to create independent homelands for specific ethno-linguistic groups. Closer to home, the BBC has also been historically hostile to the movement for Scottish independence, as well as the Irish Republican Army and its goal for a reunified Ireland under a single republic, free from British occupation. So have a look and compare how the BBC treats the separatists in the Yugoslav wars, or in India, and the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, with how they treat Scottish separatists, or Catalan separatists, or the Irish Republican Army, and you'll see the dual standard. And while it may be easy to point out supposed Western hypocrisy in this treatment, it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. This is a sign of status within colonial powers and superpowers. If they have the power to apply one set of rules to you and a different set of rules to themselves, it demonstrates that they have power over you. So with great enthusiasm, the BBC and all of its media competitors were very much in favor of Tony Blair and his successors in the UK, engaging in supposedly humanitarian military interventions in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, and others, as well as accelerating color revolutions and regime change in countries that they thought were hostile and needed to be brought closer to the Western folk.
For those that believe the sun has long set on the interventionist British Empire, this small factoid might come as a startling jolt. Recently declassified documents revealed that the UK had planned or executed over 40 attempts to remove foreign governments in 27 countries since the end of World War II. That is, over 40 regime change coups involving British intelligence agencies, covert and overt military interventions, and of course, assassinations. Of these 40-plus coups, probably the most well-known coup staged by British intelligence since 1945 was the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected government in 1953, an operation MI6 planned with the CIA. After years of speculation and suspicion dismissed as conspiracy theories, in a program called Document and subtitled A Very British Coup, BBC Radio 4 finally admitted their connivance in this devious act of regime change for the British establishment. Document reveals the BBC's role in what is now accepted as Britain's catalytic involvement in the coup of 1953, which toppled Iran's democratically elected government and replaced it with the tyranny of the Shah. The program explains Iran had just nationalized the very oil fields that had powered Britain through 2 world wars. Downing Street wanted them back. London paid Iranian agents to sow seeds of dissent in Tehran. Then, to win American support for a coup, the men from the ministry fanned fears of a Russian invasion. In the early 1950s, August 1952, the Americans would be more likely to work with us if they saw the problem as one of containing communism rather than restoring the position of the AIOC. What was needed was a sustained campaign against the nationalization of oil, the creation of an atmosphere of fear, with fake news to be proliferated to infect the clergy, the intelligentsia, media, academia, and of course, the general masses. In effect, what was needed was a BBC hit job. As the programme document revealed, even the BBC was used to spearhead Britain's propaganda campaign. In fact, Auntie Beeb agreed to broadcast the very code word that was to spark revolution. Revolution in reality meant the coup. Annabel Sreberny and Masume Torfe published a detailed study in 2014 called Persian Service.
Thank you, Vinodji. We're also hoping to establish with the documentary that the Kurukshetra is global. There are agents who have got a lot of experience in breaking up large bodies of populations. We saw what was done in Yugoslavia, how it was broken down. Do you really think that a population group, consistent, cohesive, functioning together with dharmic principles, is something that the Breaking India forces are going to allow? So whenever I come across news items about local issues where so much energy is being poured in to fight each other or to get a little piece of this or deprive somebody of a little piece of that, these are small fights. These are small wars. There's a much, much bigger war being played, and we have to make sure we are not pawns in that bigger war. We wanted to introduce a number of these ideas where the BBC was actively involved in regime change. Navita ji?
So most of you will be familiar with the fact that Western powers always seem to be lecturing the rest of the world to follow their rules-based order. But if it could be proven that the BBC acts in a manner that breaks these rules, wouldn't it be a crime? If it breached the very same international rules upon which international law is based, and if that led to a war, strife, and human suffering, wouldn't the BBC be then a war criminal? We've seen some of that in the previous section when we showed a little bit about Iran, but there's much more in the full documentary, so please do watch it. And now, turning to how the BBC presents itself, it always speaks from a moral high ground, that it represents everything that is good, decent, right. But now the mask seems to be falling off. Its duplicity and its hypocrisy is becoming more revealed every day. We looked at the actual standards, the operating procedures, the morals, the ethics, which the BBC claims to apply to itself. And the next section shows some of what we found.
The BBC has been embroiled in many sexual abuse scandals involving prominent figures associated with the organization. Noticeable, however, is the stark inconsistency between its charter, which contains high-minded declarations of morality and ethics, and the BBC's actual track record. Let's look at some of the more notorious cases. Perhaps the most infamous case is that of Jimmy Savile, a BBC presenter who was revealed to have sexually abused hundreds of victims, including children, over several decades. His predatory behavior shocked the public and raised questions about the BBC's culture and practices. It is also notable that the current UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, headed the Crown Prosecution Service when it dropped the case against Savile in 2009.
If bias has another name, if deceit has another name, it's BBC. The world has different understandings of them, but BBC means British Broadcasting Corporation. Bunch of colonialists. They catch hold of all the wrong people to manufacture their fake news. They tried a similar feat with Sadhguru, but Sadhguru waved them off like a boss.
சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதி வாங்கல அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு குற்றச்சாட்டும் வைக்கப்படுது. இத பத்தி நீங்க என்ன நினைக்கிறீங்க?
எவ்வளவு தடவை இதை கேக்குறீங்க?
சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதி வந்து வாங்காம தான்
யாரு சொன்னாங்க? இல்ல நீங்க இல்ல நீங்க நியூஸ் பாக்குறீங்களா இல்ல கவர்மெண்ட் டிபார்ட்மெண்ட் சொல்றது பாக்குறீங்களா?
நான் என்ன கேட்க வரேன் அப்படின்னா சுற்றுச்சூழல் சார்ந்து
இல்லைங்க நாட்டுல சட்டம் இருக்குதா? இல்ல நாட்டுல சட்டம் இருக்குதா?
இருக்குங்க.
அரசாங்கம் இருக்குதான், அவர் வேலை பண்ணட்டுமே, விட்டுடுங்க. அவருக்கு நீங்க எதுக்கு பண்றீங்க, விடுங்க.
ஒரே ஒரு புரியுதுங்க. அதாவது வந்து சுற்றுச்சூழல் வந்து இவ்வளவு அக்கறையோட இருக்கும்போது கட்டுமானங்கள் செய்யறதுக்கு முன்னாடியே வாங்க வேண்டிய சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதியை
இல்ல
பின்னாடி எதனால
நாட்டுல
முன்னாடியே வாங்கியிருக்கலாம்.
நாட்டுல அரசாங்கம் இருக்குதான், சட்டம் இருக்குதான், அவர் வேலை அவர் பண்றோம். நீங்க என்ன பண்றீங்க, விடுங்க. என்ன ப்ளீஸ்.
இல்ல ஈஷாவோட இதுலயே சுற்றுச்சூழல் அனுமதி வாங்காம வயலேட் பண்ணிட்டோம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லி அனுமதிக்காக அப்ளை பண்ணிருக்கு. இத பத்தி நம்மளோட கருத்து. இல்ல நான் என்ன கேட்க வரேன் அப்படின்னா, இவ்வளவு சுற்றுச்சூழல் அக்கறையோட இருக்கும்போது முன்கூட்டியே அனுமதி வாங்கியிருக்கலாம்.
Listen to me. Every law that is there in the country has been followed. If there is any discrepancy, we fixed it.
So the colonialists who always wanted India to be a slave have set up their media offices here with one and only one agenda: to fool Indians about the governments, about the businessmen, famous leaders, and destroy the spiritual ethos of Bharat. They build their network with anti-nationals and the media outlets residing in Bharat. Now the most important part, who funds them? It's you, by subscribing to it. Number 2, Bill Gates. BBC receives millions from the Gates Foundation.
We were stunned when we discovered that the BBC receives not 1 or 2 millions, but many millions every year from external agencies such as the Bill Gates Foundation. We were also surprised. In fact, we couldn't keep up. We were making a documentary. In one section, we wanted to draw a conclusion of the hypocrisy between the case of Nirbhaya and India's Daughter, the documentary that the BBC had produced, which caused us so much harm around the globe. And yet, name after name kept coming forward in the news. BBC, main presenter, abuser. The latest one, Hugh Edwards, came out, and it's an absolutely extraordinary, tragic affair of what he has been doing. The list is so long that we ran out of time in our listing of all of the ethics, the transgressions against its own ethics. What we're presenting is a small snippet. This documentary is actually a resource. We have behind it a lot of evidence. We have all of the paperwork and so on and so forth. But we were aware that if we're ever going to get the BBC into court, then we would need to have an environment within which our justices would feel that they were doing the will of the people in perhaps looking at it genuinely, fairly, and authentically. And so the purpose of the documentary, part of it, is for it to be proliferated so that everybody knows the credibility of the BBC is its greatest asset. It hides behind this carefully cultivated facade of being the arbiter of what is good. It takes the moral high ground and attacks anybody else who is challenging it. Imagine what happens when that credibility is gone. I'll share with you, I did a private screening to a group of our best advocates and lawyers in New Delhi last month to show them what the evidence was and what the nature of the documentary was. At the end of it, a number of them came forward and said, give us the evidence. We will put together a petition to the appropriate legal authority and let's see if we can drag them into court. So we're going to be doing our work, but we need everybody who is watching and certainly everybody who is here to spread the message, share the information, watch the documentary, educate yourselves. How many of you knew that Britain had been involved in 42 regime changes? And yet they're the custodians of the international rules-based order. All right? And the BBC is a part of why you didn't know. Navita ji, are you next or? Please, next chapter. We're almost there.
In India, there is a bunch of portals which work in tandem with BBC. They get their inspiration and support from BBC. BBC backs them and features them in the news. For example, The Wire, money laundering accused, propaganda from NewsClick, News Laundry, Alt News, and the list goes on. There is bias, there are deceitful tactics, there are preconceived notions, there is prejudgment, and that is BBC. I request the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji and the government of Bharat to consider shut down their factories before they become national security threat.
A colonial agent of regime change would seek to diminish national cohesion, religious identity, and economic success in the target country. It would then be natural for BBC content to be a condescending portrayal of all things Indian, a reductionist and biased coverage tainting all aspects of Hinduism, and a tarring of the India growth story with a dark brush of agenda-based narratives. We would see generous servings of poverty porn to counter every economic achievement, a hyping up of any social taboos, and inflated coverage of debunked colonial tropes such as caste, ironically imposed upon India's society by the British colonizers themselves. Naturally, all of this would be broadcast whilst maintaining an impeccable, polite facade of impartiality and objectivity. And if the BBC has chosen institutionalized hatred of certain foreign countries, peoples, and cultures as their growth strategy, does it deserve to be propped up by a public license fee? Arguably, a surreptitious tax collected from an unsuspecting audience whose own interests are overlooked and often compromised. This is possibly one of the rare cases in the history of journalism where both domestic and global audiences are forced to pay for their own humiliation and dehumanization. In its reporting of the
I think you've got a feel for what it is and where you can go to get the complete story. We'll wrap up the session in a few moments, but I'm reminded that in 14th of December 1908, a scholar from Bangladesh wrote a letter to Leo Tolstoy saying, "Help." And Leo Tolstoy responded saying that the question you need to ask yourselves is, how come 30,000 relatively weak, relatively emotionally unstable people have been able to imprison a population of 300 million? This is the letter that Tolstoy wrote. And he concludes, it's self-evident that the British did not imprison the Indians imprisoned themselves. And even to this day, when I hear people saying, "Hum kya kare?" Yeah, uski responsibility hai. I see that letter that Tolstoy wrote. And there is a vision of a Bharat which was first articulated the best, I think, by Rabindranath Tagore, which I'm just going to read. It's a short statement. And I think this is what we are aspiring to. He said, and many of you, I hope, will recognize this, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. He is describing a frame of mind. He is describing the essence of a dharmic mind, the complete freedom of thought and expression. And the role of the BBC is to prevent that mind from manifesting. The role of these agencies is not to educate, it's not to inform, it's not to entertain. It's to prevent each of us from becoming free of this mental prison. Our documentary is a small contribution to that happening. I'd like to thank you very much, Ankit, from you. That's amazing. We are the architects of this, and so we love to show it to everybody, but I appreciate the time, and I appreciate that we've been running a little bit over, and so we're not going to continue with it, but it's available on the internet, it's available on Jaipur Dialogues, it's available on YouTube, it's available on Global Hindu Federation's website, it's on String Geo, it's also on Pracham, all of whom have been very courageous and said, yes, we will host this. I'd like to open the floor to Q&A, but prior to doing so, could I just invite Vinodji, who has been my partner in crime, to perhaps just join us for any questions you may have. As I think has been mentioned, these courageous efforts such as Sanjayji has taken with Jaipur Dialogues that we have taken, they involve a degree of exposure. And the Maharathis who are willing to take that exposure do need your support and protection. So if anybody, I think there was somebody asking for questions on paperwork. If there's anybody who submitted any questions, then please do so. Oh, we've got no questions. Can we go and have dinner? Oh, amazing. Well, we're going to be floating around. If there are any questions, then please do approach us and ask us. The Jaggiji.
It's not just BBC. We need to put a whole lot of media organizations like the New York Times, Guardian, all that. We need to do a dossier on each of them. But more than that, what's the possibility that we can go and we are free speech, we do what we have to do. I mean, everything we tell the West, they say, ask free speech, we do what we like.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. What if they ignore us? What if they just say it's freedom of speech? If I was in their shoes with their agenda, that's exactly what I do. And we have an answer to that. But do you really think I'm going to share it on this stage at this moment in time? There is a strategy. One thing is true. These organizations are like very large, inflated balloons full of hot air. And the size of them we look at, and 90% of people say, wow, it's so big. To defeat a hot air-filled balloon, you only need a tiny pin. And they are shaken because they know that they are not in a legitimate position, that the stance they have taken is not honest, it's not just, it's not decent. So the biggest thing that's required is for us to approach these hot air balloons, try and prick it with a little needle and see what happens. But again, I always turn to the Gita. The answer to what's going to happen is beyond my pay grade. Mine is to create the needle and take a jab, and then katte ho tum kanhaiya. We'll see what happens. Thank you, Jaggi.
Panditji, may I add a sentence to this?
You may take two.
Thank you. So it's a really good question. And I think one of the purposes of this documentary is not necessarily to change the Western media, because they're doing what they need to do for their governments. Our secondary purpose is to just inform Bharatiyas that don't believe everything that you hear in Western media, and unite and decolonize yourself. And by destroying the credibility of the BBC, it's the tip of the spear to puncture that hot air balloon that Panditji has just said, and hopefully wake up more Bharatiyas to what's really going on.
You know, we are the nation of Mukti. We gave the world the idea of moksha. Right? We have seen how a Congress Mukt Bharat is the light at the end of a tunnel. We're seeing it approach. And I absolutely assure you that a BBC Mukt Bharat is not such a difficult step. Ji. Absolutely. Hashtag BBC Mukt Bharat, please. Anji, are there any other questions? Or Ji, Anji. Ji, I became a grandfather 2 weeks ago. I have a beautiful granddaughter, and I'm afraid my hearing is not good enough to hear what you have just said. So could you please just repeat it, or if we can get a mic, that would be great. And we'll try and wrap up quite quickly. Thank you very much.
Similar to BBC, I see a similar trend in Australia as well with ABC, which is Australian Broadcasting Corporation, especially with the documentary recently against the RSS and the HSS and this anti-Hindutva narrative they've been trying to do. Do you see a link between BBC and ABC? And is it that we'll have to make more documentaries to counter each one of them?
No.
Or
It's a
one
great
slap
question.
would be enough?
It's a great question. We live in the country which has The Guardian and others like this as well. Yes, there'll be Milihu. There is no doubt about that. But if one of them can be brought into a court and the evidence presented, sabhi ko akal aa jayegi. We will do a big, things will change very quickly. I think we're agreed on that, aren't we, Vinodji? Vibhuti ji, ABC, that's your neck of the woods.
Yeah. Just few words to conclude. I hope the screen, the audio is so overwhelming that you might miss out the most important thing, which I would like to present in a very short note. Already we are reaching the end of the session. BBC is considered the world's most trusted news broadcast. That's what Google says. Is it not our responsibility, after knowing how cruel they are, is it not our responsibility to push it into the world's largest fake news industry? Right? It's our response. These people are out and out anti-India, anti-Hindu, and they're cruel in broadcasting the fake news. So it's our, whoever has seen this, please take a moment and share this. This sound is very important. It should come from us. Don't just leave it here. Take out your mobile phones, and the hashtag is BBC Mukt Bharat. We should trend it.
Thank you very much. We are so far over our time. Thank you so much for staying with us, especially whilst dinner is being served. We look forward to your support and your engagement with the documentary. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri.
आपके सामने लॉन्च हुआ BBC on trial.